does it offend you personally? Are you upset that that is the portrayal
just like
of you?
I'm upset by the fact that people in other countries in the world think I'm the greatest danger to their country.
Is it tiring?
Tiring?
Yeah.
I expect it. Any dissident and critic can anticipate that they're going to be subjected to hysterical tirades. If you're a Soviet dissident, did you expect to be treated nicely? In fact, do you think of a dissident in any country who's treated nicely? Let's go back in history. Let's take Israel, okay? You go back to the Bible. You studied the Bible, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In the Bible, there is someone who's called a hater of Israel, the prophet Elijah. King Ahab, you know, the epitome of evil in the Bible.
So in a way you see yourself as a prophet?
I'm not saying that. No. I'm seeing the prophets as intellectuals.
So it's your life mission, and therefore even
It's
your...
not my life's mission. It's the mission of any decent human being. Well, take Elijah or Jeremiah or Isaiah or any of them. Were they treated nicely? No, they were treated very badly. Elijah was called a hater of Israel, hater of Israel. Centuries later, he was honored, but not at the time. There were people who were honored at the time. Centuries later, they're called false prophets. Centuries later.
That was my... I'm laughing because I'm responding because that was my next question. How do you think history will judge you?
That's up to history. It depends who wins.
And the Jewish history.
It depends who wins the battles.
I think it would be fair to say that you've always had an extraordinary confidence in your own righteousness. And as you enter your 80s, I just wonder, are you as sure about being right now as you ever were?
Yes, but I was never that sure.
Because you come across as extraordinarily sure.
You know, if you have to state an opinion in 2 seconds, it sounds very confident. But I think I mentioned earlier that in the sciences, you have a framework of understanding. You pursue what you think is important, but you maintain in the back of your mind the recognition you may be off on completely the wrong track, and you have to backtrack.
Is that in the back of your mind today?
Always. And if I, for example, you say there's a flood of criticism. Actually, I welcome it, and I read it carefully, and I look to see if there's anything there that's valid. And with astonishing consistency, there's nothing there, as in the case that you mentioned about the dissent and denazification. The context is always eliminated. When you put the context back in, I think almost any normal person would say that's the right thing to respond.
Right after 9/11, when the United States went to war with the Taliban, claimed to an audience of 2,000 at MIT, and it was a C-SPAN speech, he said the United States is planning, or here's what he said. He said, it looks like the United States is planning a silent genocide of about 3 to 4 million people in Afghanistan. And the claim was that we were going to starve them. There was already a famine in the waiting, and the United States was going to bomb the supply trucks and starve 3 to 4 million Afghan citizens.
Except that what happened and continues to happen in Afghanistan with the American and NATO presence is in any sense just. A just war, a just conflict.
I think it's a very weak argument. Basically not. But in fact, if you want to know the truth, I think it's one of the most immoral acts in modern history.
One of the most immoral.
And let me explain why. That if you look back at October 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan because the Taliban refused to hand over suspects without evidence. Okay, now actually they had a right to do that. You're supposed to provide evidence if you want extradition. At the time, the estimates were there were about 5 million Afghans on the verge of starvation. And the estimates were that if the United States bombed, it might go to 2.5 million more. In fact, the aid agencies, which were forced to leave when the bombing was announced, bitterly condemned the bombing. Take a look, it's across the board. Almost all of them bitterly condemned the bombing. Many leading anti-Taliban Afghans, including U.S. favorites, very harshly condemned the bombing.
I mean, you said millions might die within weeks.
I was reading from the New York Times report of the official estimates.
And obviously it didn't happen, but
look, to say that it didn't happen is irrelevant. When Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba, it didn't lead to a nuclear war. And I suppose some party hack would say, well, you know, it's fine to put missiles in Cuba. It wasn't. It was criminally insane. If the worst didn't happen, that doesn't change the conditions of the choices.
The writing of Professor Chomsky, who's a very important figure on the American left. Though he calls himself an anarchist, he keeps forgetting that he is one at just the moments it might do him some good. But he is, at any rate, of major influence on the American left, and basically think the United States is a bad idea. Then you may feel a sneaking sympathy for others who feel the same, such as, for example, theocratic nihilists, who believe it's a Crusader Jewish racket. And, of course, it's very important that people make up their minds about this now and stop fooling around about it.
You asked us after September 11, one of your points was we ought to look in the mirror, we being America or the West. We ought to look in the mirror at our own. Was that a way of saying, look, people like bin Laden are angry at us for good reason?
No,
in other words, is there a way to justify...
That's not what I was saying. The statement of mine that you just quoted is a very conservative statement. In fact, it was articulated by George Bush's favorite philosopher, Jesus Christ, who pointed out, famously defined the notion hypocrite. A hypocrite is a person who focuses on the other fellow's crimes and refuses to look at his own. That's the definition of hypocrite by George Bush's favorite philosopher. When I repeat that, I'm not taking a radical position. I'm taking a position which is just elementary morality.
But even if he is a hypocrite, and they
We're all,
even,
not he,
just,
everyone.
Okay, even
Can
if
you let me ask another question? See, here's an experiment. Try to find a phrase in the massive commentary on September 11th which is not hypocritical in the sense of George Bush's favorite philosopher. Find one phrase.
All right, but before,
I don't think you can do it.
Okay, but before, I don't want to get Gnostic here and religious on it, but I do want to...
This is not religion. This is elementary morality. If people cannot rise to the level of applying to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, they have no right to talk about right and wrong or good and evil.
But let's talk...
There are some views, people who support the Soviet Union, as Chomsky did for so long, who've supported tyranny in all sorts of ways like Chomsky has done, who've lied consistently as Chomsky has done, who do not deserve fundamental respect in this sense.
Two forces in the world that are attempting to carry out the, in my view, quite ludicrous attempt to identify the Soviet Union with communism. One is the Soviet leadership itself, which is trying to exploit the positive image of the egalitarian communist tradition for their own benefit, and the other is the United States, the American propaganda system, which also would like to undermine that egalitarian vision by associating it with Russian totalitarianism. But I don't think that we should, and you're right, I mean, this leads to a situation in which the values of the egalitarian socialist tradition, the libertarian egalitarian socialist tradition, are associated in the American mind with the brutal and repressive Soviet state, which in my view has nothing whatsoever to do with communism or anything, no connection with it. And these things I think very much should be dissociated. So I wouldn't think that, for example, I think the American people have very good reason, or everyone has good reason, to fear the Russian state, which is a violent and repressive and brutal autocracy. The Union, it seems to me, yes, it is a repressive and, dissent is suppressed, and it's, in my view, it's a dungeon. It's kind of a dungeon with a certain degree of social services. Now, and it is also a threat. It's a threat to the government. It's a threat to its own population. It's a threat to, in fact, anyone within its reach.
As far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. If you take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for workers' organization and so on. In fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now, that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And you could say they're defective instruments that had to be worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by the in a sense, in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. There's the Soviet Union calls it socialism. And after they took control of they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly. He kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They would just kind of hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to sort of exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own and quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but they basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition. And I think the answer that you'll discover when you look at that is that they didn't. In fact, this was a destruction of socialist institutions. Well, this may be true or it may be false, but if it's true, and I think the evidence pretty strongly supports it, then I don't see any reason why we shouldn't express that fact. And I certainly don't think that we should be deterred in expressing this fact if other people who's, fascists or whatever, happen to condemn the Soviet Union, just for the same reasons that Trotsky mentioned in the 1930s.
Introduce you first in a few lines. Professor Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, is nu 60 en is ongeveer de meest controversiële intellectueel van Amerika. Dat is ook alweer een platitude, maar zo wordt hij nu eenmaal altijd genoemd.
Chomsky has been called the Einstein of modern linguistics. The New York Times has said he's arguably the most important intellectual alive today, but his presence here has sparked a protest.
This book that has poisoned the world, and all liar in there. And as a Vietnamese people, we come here to warn the book. Vietnam! Vietnam!
He said that in Vietnam there's no violation of human rights and no crime in Cambodia is wrong.
Chomsky is using, he's a professor. He's using that to poison the world. And we come here to protest that.
I don't mind the denunciations, frankly. I mind the lies. I mean, intellectuals are very good at lying. They're professionals at it. You know, vilification is a wonderful technique. There's no way of responding to it. If somebody calls you, an anti-Semite, what can you say? I'm not an anti-Semite. Or, somebody says you're a racist, you're a Nazi or something. You always lose. I mean, the person who throws in the mud always wins because there's no way of responding to such charges.
Professor Chomsky seems to believe that the people he criticizes fall into one of two classes, liars or dupes. Consider what happened when I discussed the case of Robert Faurisson. Let me recall the facts.
Let's not go into details, please, because
the details happen to be important.
Yes, but I have only one question on the Faurisson question.
Do the facts matter or don't they matter?
Of course they do.
Well, let me tell you what the facts are now.
Faurisson says that the massacre of the Jews in the Holocaust is a historic lie.
No, this is an important one. It has a lot to do with the topic.
Your views are extremely controversial, and perhaps one of the things that has been most controversial and you've been most strongly criticized for was your defense of a French intellectual who was suspended from his university post for contending that there were no Nazi death camps in World War II.
My name is Robert Faurisson. I am 60. I am university professor in Lyon, France. Behind me, you may see the courthouse of Paris, the Palais de Justice. In this place, I was convicted many times at the beginning of the 80s. I was charged by 9 associations, mostly Jewish associations, for inciting hatred, racial hatred, for racial defamation, for damage by falsifying a story.
Professor Chomsky and a number of other intellectuals signed a petition in which Faurisson is called a respected professor of literature who merely tried to make his findings public.
Perhaps we can start with just the story of Robert Faurisson and your involvement.
More than 500 people signed, maybe 600, mostly universitaires, scholars.
And what happened to the other 499 of them? How come we only hear about Chomsky's signature?
Well, I think it's because Chomsky is in himself a kind of political power.
I signed a petition calling on the tribunal to defend his civil rights. At that point, the French press, which apparently has no conception of freedom of speech, concluded that since I had called for his civil rights, I was therefore defending his theses.
Faurisson then published a book in which he tried to prove that the Nazi gas chambers never existed.
What we deny is that there was an extermination program and an extermination actually, especially in gas chambers or gas vans.
The book contains a preface written by Professor Chomsky in which he calls Faurisson a relatively apolitical sort of liberal.
A communist is a man, a Jew is a man, a Nazi is a man, I am a man.
Are you a Nazi?
I am not a Nazi.
How would you describe yourself politically?
Nothing.
Preface that you wrote,
that's not the preface that I wrote because I never wrote a preface, and you know that I never wrote a preface.
Yeah, we done that.
He's referring to a statement of mine on civil liberties, which was added to a book in which Faurisson, excuse me. Yes, I used.
And the language you use has meaning.
That's right, and the language I use.
A political liberal, or as someone whose views can be dignified by the word findings or conclusions, that is a judgment, and that is a favorable judgment of his views.
On the contrary.
Can I continue with the facts?
Yes, you can continue with the facts for hours, but I mean,
but
there are a few facts that, yeah, okay.
Let's get to the so-called preface. I was then asked by the person who organized the petition to write a statement on freedom of speech, just banal comments about freedom of speech, pointing out the difference between defending a person's right to express his views and defending the views expressed. So I did that. I wrote a rather banal statement called Some Elementary Remarks on Freedom of Expression, and I told him, do what you like with it.
So Pierre produced a book which all the arguments of Faurisson were to be put in front of the court. And we thought wise to use the text of Noam Chomsky as a kind of warning, a foreword, to say that it was a matter of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of research.
Why did you try at the last moment to get it back from the book?
That's the one thing I'm sorry about.
But that's the real important thing.
It's
of
not.
Course,
You mean the fact that I tried to retract
because with that you said it was wrong of you
I
to
didn't.
do it.
See, in fact, take a look at what I wrote a letter, which was then publicized, in which I said, look, things have reached the point where the French intellectual community simply is incapable of understanding the issues. At this point, it's just going to confuse matters even more if my comments on freedom of speech happen to be attached to this book, which I didn't know existed. So just to clarify things, you better separate them. Now, in retrospect, I think I probably shouldn't have done that. I should have just said, fine, then let it appear, because it ought to appear. But that's, apart from that, I regard this as not only trivial, but as compared with other positions I've taken on freedom of speech, invisible. I do not think that the state ought to have the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from it. I'm not willing to give the state that right, even if they happen to
But are you denying that the gas chambers ever existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech. Now, you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything like objectivity, or scientific objectivity, reality? As a scientist,
look, I'm not saying I defend the views. Look, if somebody publishes a scientific article, which I disagree with, I do not say the state ought to put him in jail. Right?
All right, but you don't have to support him right away and say, you know, I support him just for the sake of everybody saying that, you know, whatever he wants to say.
Suppose this guy is taken to court and charged with falsification. Then I'm going to defend him, even if I disagree.
But he wasn't taken to court.
Oh, you're wrong.
But when did you write the support? I mean,
when he was brought to court. And in fact, the only support that I gave him is to say he has a right of freedom of speech, period.
There is no doubt in my mind that the example that I gave about the story with the Holocaust that did not exist is very, very typical.
How much
I'll give you another example about
how much of the American press believes that Faurisson has anything to say, or any press? How much of the press in France?
Since I followed...
What percentage would you say?
I'll tell you.
Is it higher than zero?
Is
it higher than zero?
I'll tell you.
Have you ever seen anything in any newspaper or any journal saying that this man is anything other than a lunatic?
I'll try to answer. I'll try to answer. I think that I just followed the case.
That's a simple question.
I followed the case 5 or 6 years ago, and I happened to see that Noam Chomsky was in for strong criticism, even from some of his supporters, for doing something which could be interpreted only in terms of a campaign against Israel.
Going back years, I am absolutely certain that I've taken far more extreme positions on people who deny the Holocaust than you have. For example, you go back to my earliest articles and you will find that I say that even to enter into the arena of debate on the question of whether the Nazis carried out such atrocities is already to lose one's humanity. So I don't even think you ought to discuss the issue if you want to know my opinion. But if anybody wants to refute Faurisson, there's certainly no difficulty in doing so.
I'm not interested in freedom of speech and all that. I have to win, and that's the question. And I shall win.
That what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because in fact, that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do. Nor would I say it. In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily.
Because your method is not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore the corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological
That's
agenda.
totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example. Okay. One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely false. I mean, just ask the people who are involved in, I mean, you know, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. In fact, if you look at the things we've written, I mean, let's take a look. I mean, I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. In it, we discuss three kinds of atrocities. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. You know, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect?
There isn't a word in this that he writes that you can trust on its own. You have to look everything up. And this is, of course, an education in the themes of our times. Chomsky is a Holocaust supporter of Holocaust deniers. He is was an apologist for Pol Pot, who was responsible for the Cambodian genocide. He is a hater of Israel. He's a hater of America. And reading this book will give you a kind of education in the kind of main themes of the time, including the war on terror.
And it was published as The Political Economy of Human Rights, a two-volume book that came out in 1979. Well, Southend Press wasn't going to pulp it, so it exists. In fact, you can even buy it. Now, what happened at that point? You can't pulp the book any longer, so how do you react to it? Well, there are two ways of reacting to it. The main way is to ignore it. There were a lot of things in the book. You can read it and see what was there, but, for example, there was a discussion of U.S. foreign policy in the media. Basically, that's what it was. And extensive case studies of both topics and so on and so forth. Mostly it was ignored, as you'd predict. But it wasn't entirely ignored. There was one exception, and a very interesting exception. Let me give you the background. It explains some of the more subtle ways in which the system works. In this, one of the things we did in this, in order to put the propaganda model to a test, we didn't call it the propaganda model then, it's the same thing. In order to put it to a test, we tried to compare sort of paired historical incidents, kind of like I was doing in connection with the freedom of press issue. I mean, history doesn't create exact controlled experiments, but there are enough cases that are similar enough so you can test how the media are going to deal with them. And we looked for such cases. We looked for atrocities. And we divided the atrocities we looked at into three categories. What we called constructive bloodbaths, meaning ones that are good for U.S. power and the corporate class, so they're constructive. Benign bloodbaths, one where U.S. power and privilege doesn't care very much one way or another. It's sort of irrelevant. And nefarious bloodbaths. Those are the ones carried out by official enemies. So we had various types of benign, constructive, and nefarious bloodbaths. And we gave quite a number of examples of these. Well, our prediction was that the media would welcome the constructive bloodbaths, that they would ignore the benign bloodbaths, and that they would become outraged over the nefarious bloodbaths. And in fact, in the case of the nefarious bloodbaths, they would invent all sorts of fantasies and so on and so forth to make them look even worse than they were. That was the prediction. And we gave a bunch of cases, and we showed that, I think, we tried to show, and I think did show, that the predictions were correct. Now, there's actually another prediction that comes out of that model, which we didn't make, but it's implicit if you think about it. And that has to do with the way that this exposure will be responded to. What you'd predict, if you think it through, is that our discussion of the constructive bloodbaths would be ignored, because to reveal the fact that the media welcomed huge bloodbaths, as they did, would not be very conducive to the interests of power or to the media. It would also expose the fraud about the apparent anger over nefarious bloodbaths. So you'd expect the constructive bloodbaths to be ignored. As far as the benign bloodbaths are concerned, you might expect an occasional statement, since it's, the fact that the media ignored the benign bloodbaths doesn't show such terrible things. It doesn't, at least they didn't applaud them. And as long as you can exclude the role of the United States in being involved in them, not terrible, maybe a few odd comments. With regard to the nefarious bloodbaths, what you'd expect is fury and venom over the fact that the media, that the fabrications over bloodbaths of the enemy were exposed as a fraud. And that's important, and that can be used. It can be used, in fact, to defame the critics. See, if you show that people are lying about the crimes of official enemies, you can easily distort that into a defense of those crimes, right? Okay, now what happened? Well, let me take two cases, which were very close. Two cases that we discussed were the slaughter in Timor from 1975 to 1979, and the slaughter in Cambodia in the same years, 1975 to 79. And we compared those two cases. The one in Timor we called a benign bloodbath. The United States didn't care much one way or the other. So hundreds of thousands of Timorese get killed. It's not very interesting. The case in Cambodia was, of course, a nefarious bloodbath. That was the bad guys doing it. And we gave a very detailed account of what evidence was available about these two. They're in the same area of the world, the same years, the same time frame. The evidence available was comparable. The slaughters were apparently comparable in scale. The one in Timor was considerably greater relative to the population, but probably roughly comparable in scale. The difference was that in Cambodia it was carried out by the enemy, Pol Pot, whereas in Timor it was carried out by a friend, Indonesia. And furthermore, it was carried out by Indonesia with American arms, which were provided by the Carter administration, which were expanded. The arms flow was expanded by the Carter administration as the atrocities increased. Well, how did the media deal with this? First, fact number one, we went through this in detail. The media dealt with the Timor bloodbaths by suppressing them. There was considerable coverage of Timor, believe it or not, in 1974 and 75. This was all in the context of the breakup of the Portuguese Empire. As Indonesia attacked Timor and the massacre started with U.S. support, coverage began to drop. When the massacre hit its peak in 1978, and it was really approaching genocide with increasing U.S. support, coverage dropped to zero, literally zero. That's the way they dealt with the Timor massacre. What about the Cambodia massacre? Well, within weeks after the Khmer Rouge took power, they were already being accused of genocide by the New York Times. About a year later, they were being accused of carrying out auto-genocide and of having murdered 2 million people. In fact, even of having boasted of having murdered 2 million people. That became the conventional line. There then came a huge outcry ranging from the Reader's Digest and TV Guide over to the New York Review of Books, and including just about everything in between. Vast outcry of outrage over the communist monsters who were carrying out this horrifying bloodbath and so on and so forth. Interestingly, in all of there was a tremendous amount of fabrication, just plain fabrication of evidence. For example, let's just give you one example. Take this 2 million boast of 2 million killed. You know, that's what everybody's heard. You ask people, how many people had Pol Pot killed by, say, 1977? They'll say 2 million. Here's where it comes from. There was a book published by a French priest, Francois Panchaud is his name, who's from Cambodia. He wasn't there then, but he knew about Cambodia. He published a book in French. The book was, of course, not available in English. It was in French. It was reviewed by a French journalist named Jean Lacouture. It was reviewed in France. That review was immediately picked up and translated in the United States. It appeared in the New York Review of Books. That's the fastest translation of a review of a French book that's ever appeared. In the review, Lacouture said this. He said, according to Panchaud, the Khmer Rouge boast of having murdered 2 million people, auto-genocide, horrifying, and so on. He gave a whole bunch of quotes from the book about the horrifying things the Khmer Rouge said, and so on and so forth. That was immediately picked up by the rest of the media. It was all over the place, you know, newspaper articles, oh my God, look what they're doing, and so on and so forth. Well, I was curious at the time, because that didn't, you know, I hadn't seen the evidence about that, and I just wanted to know what was going on. So the book was unavailable, so I wrote to friends in France and asked them to send it to me. And I got the book, and I probably was the only person in the United States who had read it, although it was being quoted all over the place on the basis of this review. And I quickly discovered that the whole review was a total fraud. Whatever was going on in Cambodia, that's not what the book said. The book didn't say anything about a boast of 2 million people. The quotes that were given in the review either didn't appear in the book, or maybe you could sort of figure out what they were from, you know, some wording a little bit like them, but they were grossly distorted. And some of them weren't even quotes from the Khmer Rouge. They were quotes from Thai and so on. But and in fact, every factual statement in the review was just totally false. Here's the way the 2 million figure came. Panchaud in the book says that about 800,000 people were killed in the American War, 70 to 75, meaning primarily by American bombing in the war that the United States ran from 70 to 75. That's 800,000 people. He then said that according to the American embassy in Bangkok, 1.2 million had died, not been killed, since the war was over. Well, Lacouture, during the review, just added those two numbers together, called them the Khmer Rouge killings, and then added the boast for good effect. Well, that's where that figure comes from. Anyhow, after I read the book, I wrote a letter to Lacouture, who I know, and I told him, look, I don't know what the facts are about Cambodia, but the relation between your review and the book is zilch. And I think you ought to correct it because your review is being quoted all over the place. Well, he actually published corrections in the New York Review. You know, he said, yeah, he made a couple of mistakes. He said, well, maybe the number killed wasn't 2 million. Maybe it was just in the thousands, he said. A slight difference. You know, a factor of 1,000 difference. But he said, it really doesn't matter. You know, it's terrible anyway, and so on. Well, after his corrections appeared, they were dismissed, and people kept repeating the 2 million figure that he invented, almost half of which was attributed to the American War, notice. Well, that's one example, but it's just typical. If you read our chapter on this, you'll see a level of fabrication which, you know, is mind-boggling. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Now, this had nothing to do with the fact, of course, there was a massacre. In fact, as we pointed out, the massacre was probably comparable to the massacre in Cambodia, which was in Timor, which is a huge massacre. We also pointed out that of all the evidence available, there was one part that was being suppressed systematically by the American press, interestingly. That part was the information given by State Department intelligence. Now, the State Department Cambodia watchers, you know, State Department intelligence, they were the only people with any evidence about what was going on in Cambodia. And they apparently had pretty good intelligence. They claimed to be able to even pick up radio transmissions and all sorts of stuff. And they were giving a totally different story. They said that what was going on, that there was, you know, big slaughter, but they said it was in the tens or hundreds of thousands, and it was not mass genocide, but it was rather mostly harsh conditions and, you know, brutality and so on. That was the position of the only people who knew anything. And that was systematically excluded. It was just the wrong picture. You know, it wasn't bloody enough for the purposes. Well, we went through all of this stuff, the suppression of the Timor massacre, the vast amount of lying about the Cambodia massacres, and we gave that as an example of treatment of paired massacres, where they were both treated. Now, here's the one place where the book was not ignored. What we said about constructive bloodbaths, totally ignored. What we said about Timor, almost totally ignored. To the extent that it was mentioned, the U.S. role was excluded. What we said about Cambodia, however, that elicited a huge new outrage over the fact that we were defending Pol Pot. Well, we were defending Pol Pot by saying that he was carrying out a slaughter comparable to the major slaughter that the United States was backing in Indonesia, and pointing out that, in fact, that was the picture given by American intelligence, the only people who knew anything about it, and then talking about the way this was distorted in the interests of the propaganda system. But that didn't matter. Here, see, what we were doing was challenging the right to lie in the service of the state, and that's a very important right to maintain. So therefore, the standard view is, and you can read this all over the place now, is that we, or usually it's me for some reason, I don't know why they decide it's me, but we were defending Pol Pot, and sort of apologists for Pol Pot. You take a look back, and you'll see that we described it as a major massacre. We said a lot is uncertain, and then just described the facts as they were and compared them with the media fabrications. And you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to expose media fabrications, and the reason why that was discussed, the one part of the book, virtually nothing about Timor ever is discussed. The reason why that one part is discussed is because that can be used by further lies to defame and undermine critics. So therefore that's done. Well, that's the more subtle way in which the propaganda system works. I should say, incidentally, that some of this stuff is really kind of amusing. Those of you who read this stuff will have seen it. William Shawcross wrote a book a little after that, in which he claimed, The Quality of Mercy, it's called, very favorably reviewed all over the press. Everybody fell in love with it. In the book, he claims that there was silence over the Pol Pot atrocities. And then he asked the question, how could this happen? It's called Holocaust in the Modern Conscience. Well, first of all, was there silence over the Pol Pot atrocities? No, there was a vast uproar over the Pol Pot atrocities. That started a couple of weeks after it. At the time when they were being accused of genocide, they had probably killed a couple of thousand people at the most. Within a year, as I said, it was being everywhere from TV Guide and the Reader's Digest over to the New York Review, and then it went on like that. A huge chorus of protest. Further, there were tons of fabrication. But it's flattering to say, it's useful, it's serviceable to say there was silence. Why is it serviceable? Because if you can claim that there was silence, then you can raise the profound question of why the West was silent over this massacre, and that means from now on we must be even more diligent in exposing the crimes of official enemies to overcome the fact that we were silent this time. So immediately Shawcross is quoted all over the place, and every newspaper is saying, oh my God, we were silent, how could we have been silent, and so on. Then Shawcross goes on to explain the silence. You take a look at his book, he explains the silence. First, this was in the Washington Post, then in his book. He says the reason for the silence, the primary reason for the silence, is the skepticism of the left, primarily me. So in other words, by my skepticism, I silenced all the Western media and governments. It's a lot of power. Furthermore, and remember what that skepticism was. It was a skepticism about documented lies. Furthermore, he cites an alleged statement in a footnote. He doesn't date it or identify the source. There's two good reasons for that. One is that the citation is fabricated. The other is that the source, to the extent that there's a source, it's in a book. It's in exactly this book, which went to press after the fall of Pol Pot and came out almost a year after the fall of Pol Pot. So what he's claiming is that in a book that went to press after Pol Pot was overthrown and that appeared almost a year after, in that book we succeeded retrospectively in silencing the entire Western media and governments for 4 years. Well, that's, not only were we powerful enough to scare the entire West into silence, but we even could do it by magic, Now that was quoted. That was quoted all over the place with great awe. The point is there's no absurdity so extreme that it won't be quoted with respect if it's useful. And here it's useful for several purposes. One, to protect the right to lie in the service of the state. Two, to undermine and defame critics who you can't answer. And three, to claim that we didn't look hard enough, we were silent over this atrocity. Well, there was an atrocity that the West was silent over. It's the one we documented, Timor. And they were silent over it because the West was doing it, and therefore you're silent over it. That's the real question of Holocaust and the modern conscience, but nobody will discuss that one. Well, these are all examples of more subtle ways of controlling thought, more subtle and complex. That's the aftermath I had in mind. It's a very interesting story. We review it in Manufacturing Consent.
It's plagiarized from St. Augustine, who in the City of God has a story about Alexander. His forces capture a pirate, and there's an audience between the pirate and the emperor, and he asks the pirate, "How dare you molest the seas?" And the pirate asks him, tells him, "I'm a small man with a tiny boat, so they call me a pirate. You're an emperor with a vast navy, and you molest the world, but they call you an emperor." And that's a good allegory for the world, and in particular the contemporary world. The pirates are the ones who are condemned, not the emperors. Of course, the general population is attacked by both the emperors and the pirates. So it's not that the pirate, St. Augustine is not saying that the pirate is a nice fellow. He's just saying he's a small criminal as compared with a major criminal.
So who does control the world? Who are the emperors?
Overwhelmingly the United States since the Second World War, Britain before that, and concentrations of private power, which are enormous, and tyrannical corporations closely linked to the powerful states. It's a network of concentrated power with international institutions like the IMF and so on, which are called, they sometimes call themselves the masters of the world. That's a phrase that was in the Financial Times, a little ironically, but not wrong. Actually, they call themselves the masters of the universe. Adam Smith called themselves the masters of the world. Now they're called the masters of the universe.
We've gone a bit beyond it.
Yeah, didn't have space age in Smith's time.
But don't you sometimes need big government to deal with big business, that in a sense there is a kind of balance between these large forces?
It's like saying there's a balance between two members of the board of directors of General Motors. Yes, there's some kind of a balance, but they're so closely interlinked and they're connected that they're, to first approximation, they're the same thing. You look over history, one after another form of coercion and control has been broken. As the Soviet system was collapsed from inside, every system of tyranny we know about and oppression has been, people chip away at it and it ultimately collapses. There's nothing special about them. I mean, the systems of power that exist now are quite fragile, and they know it. So the World Economic Forum, for example, is well aware. That's what the Financial Times called the masters of the universe. They're well aware of how fragile their control is and concerned about it, and rightly.
What I wonder, though, is how you square your fundamental optimism about human nature with what seems to be a pretty pessimistic analysis of what's happening in the world.
It's a famous phrase that was borrowed by Gramsci, and that we should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. It's sensible.
Your parents, I think your father was originally from Ukraine. Your mum was from what's now known as Belarus. Both were Jews, both arrived in the United States, and it's perhaps fair to say that had they not made it to the United States, they would have been killed.
Sure.
Faced terrible turmoil.
Like the rest of the family who didn't come. Yeah.
Your work for more than 40 years has focused on what you call the terrorism, the criminal acts of the United States. And yet, your parents knew America as a safe haven, as a place of opportunity, of security. How did those two elements of your life fit together?
Very simply, the same way they did for my parents. Yes, it's a land of opportunity, and in fact we know why. It's a land of opportunity because the British colonists came and effectively exterminated the indigenous population, which is a typical property of settler colonialism, the worst kind of imperialism, conquered half of Mexico, instituted slavery, committed huge crimes, and created a rich, prosperous country from which I benefit enormously. Well, there's an elementary moral principle, and since then have gone on to carry out horrendous crimes everywhere. The Vietnam War alone is probably, I think, the worst crime since the Second World War. maybe 4 million people killed, 3 countries devastated. These are real crimes, and there are many others.
Well, I don't want to go into too much detail. I think it's more the style of argument that I'm getting at now.
See, I think the style of argument should be that we should tell the truth about important things. And for each of us, and this is an elementary moral principle, the most important thing for each of us is the predictable consequences of our own actions. It's very easy to condemn the crimes of others. So, Stalinist hacks condemned the crimes of the West. I don't applaud them for that. I applaud the Soviet dissidents who condemned the crimes of the Soviet Union. And it's the same for each of us, in individual life or anywhere else.
But Noam Chomsky's world is a black and white world when it comes to the United States. You constantly focus upon what you regard as the evils done, the crimes committed by the United States.
For a reason.
What about the good things that the United States does? What about the reasons which drive millions of people from the poorest parts of this planet to want to live in the United States, to be American?
In the richest country in the world, yeah. And I'm glad my parents came here, otherwise they would have been in death camps. But sure, that's true. And in fact, what you say is not, just consider these last few minutes of discussion. One of the things that I did was praise the United States, praise it for the significant changes that civilized the society substantially in the last 40 years, coming from popular activism.
I'll finish with a personal question. You're how old now?
82.
Why haven't you mellowed?
Because I look at the world, and there's things happening in the world which should lead anyone to become indignant, outraged, active, and simply engaged.